Joining us today is Rick Maurer, and it's wonderful to have him with us. And you'll also notice that Brit and Ian are on the conversation as well. Hi, Brit. Hi, Ian. Hi, Rick.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey. We're just going to explore with Rick why it is that sometimes people support us in things we're trying to do. Why is it that they sometimes resist us? And there's all sorts of complexities which Rick will sort of help us through. But the idea is that we get a bit of clarity around when, particularly if we're young leaders, when we're trying to do something, maybe for the first time, maybe we're in post for the first time, it's a tough call to get people to come along with an idea that you've got or to make changes to some of the things that you feel need to be made. So Rick's going to try and help us through the minefield. So Rick, can you just sort of kick off first of all by these two things, support and resistance? What's that about?
Okay, good. Actually, let me start the way that I often start presentations. And Brit, if I can use you as my guinea pig, I would appreciate that. Okay, you don't have to do a thing, but just I want you to imagine that we work together and I report to Brit, let's say, and I've got this. I went to bed last night, came up with this idea. By this morning, it had turned into a brilliant idea. I'm ready to go. And I run in this morning to the one person who needs to support me, and that's Brit. And I go, hey, you got a second? And she goes, well, I'm kind of going to a meeting. Okay, well, let's walk and talk. And we're walking and talking. Clearly, she's trying to get to where she wants to go. And I'm talking about my brilliant idea. I mean, it's just why the timing is great, why I'd be the right person to lead it, on and on and on. And then, I get done with my fevered pitch, and I actually look at her now, and I noticed her eyes have glazed over, and I figure, she didn't understand. I'm going to explain it again. So now I go back, and I start explaining again. But what happens, I'm making matters worse. So what's happened in those few moments is I've created the resistance. She wasn't resistant to me beforehand. She might not even be resistant to the idea, but the way I handled it got in my way. And so as a quick beginning answer to your question, Matthew, is that often we make up our own resistance by the way that we introduce things. Like if I come up with an idea and now I'm telling the three of you about it, you may be talking to each other and going, who died and made him God? Or where did that come from? That sort of thing. What I find is one of the things that really distinguishes a lot of good leaders in organizations. I mean, there's people who can really build support for their ideas from those who aren't so consistently good, is how well they're able to really deal with that, what seems intangible, that notion of support and resistance, and just sort of either have a conscious knowledge of what to do or just an intuitive sense of how to deal with other people. So a better leader would not do what I did with Brit. They would catch that she was busy. Yeah. They would catch that my own excitement was getting in my way. That they might say, sounds like you're busy right now. Look, I'm really excited. Is there any chance that we could grab a cup of coffee later? Is there any, there would be those tiny little kind of moments of truth that if I pay attention to them, I'm going to be different. And, if I took a class in leadership, I'd probably score the same as anybody else on other things. But it's that attention to that kind of subjective detail, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's about situational awareness as well and timing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, all of that. And if it would be helpful, I can talk about the three levels I identified.
Yeah, do.
Okay. Well, when I first this was in the late 80s, and I had some of my clients were, starting to go through big changes, and they were always complaining about resistance. And at the time, except for Daryl Connor's work, on something at the speed of change, it's a really good book. He was talking respectfully about what resistance is. Everything else was either superficial, like one book was like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Well, I'll do you a favor on Monday if you'll do me a favor on Tuesday. That's okay, but that's really minimal stuff. And so I did a literature search, and I found that in the business press, whenever they talked about resistance, there was always a verb associated with it, and that verb was overcome. We've got to overcome resistance. Now, the problem with that, it starts to set up, I'm right and you're wrong. And as soon as I do that, I'm inventing more resistance. It may even be possible that I am right and you're wrong, but just going in with that mindset means I don't need to be influenced because I know what I'm talking about. I know what we need to do. And so I thought none of this really is working. And so I was studying at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland, and they've really taken this way of thinking about human psychology and said, this applies in work groups and organizations too. And I loved the theory in Gestalt of resistance, which was, we need to respect the resistance. People resist for good reasons. They don't get out of bed in the morning, their feet hit the floor, and they go, damn, who am I going to upset today? I mean, maybe there's a couple people like that, but for the most part, we're resisting in reaction to something. And so as I thought more and more about it, I thought what I identified was 3 levels. Okay, and these all work with each other. And I'm going to start on the resistance side because they all have an opposite side, which is support. And on the resistance side, the first one is I don't get it. And this is, I see your lips moving, but I don't know what you're talking about. And it's just a lack of understanding. So it's not a deep psychological thing. It's just you're coming in from the IT department. I work in marketing. I have no idea what you're talking about. And it's not that I want to resist you. I just don't understand that language. And by the way, every professional specialty has its own jargon. And we really run the risk of taking that jargon and inflicting it on other departments. So one thing is to be multilingual in that regard. So the first thing is, I don't get it. And one of the problems with that is often we think that all resistance is because people don't get it. So even though Brit's eyes glazed over, I'll figure she didn't understand. I'll explain it again. This time I'll use more slides. I mean, it just, we keep adding on. And if it's not level 1, I'm actually making matters worse, because then she's starting to think, does he think I'm an idiot? Yeah. Okay. So that's the easiest one. Level 2 is I don't like it. And this is an emotional reaction. And really isn't strong enough. I have a strong visceral reaction based on fear, a fear of survival. It's fight, flight, or frozen like a deer in the headlights, but it's the amygdala kicks in, kind of all that stuff. And a change in organization can do that. I could lose my job. I could lose face. I could lose control. I could lose all. And one of the problems with level 2, because it's extremely powerful, is in many organizations, it's not allowed to, you can't talk about it. So imagine, Matthew, that it's your meeting and you're identifying something that needs to happen. And I'm really starting to get scared. Like, we just bought a new house. We got a kid that's going to go to college. I go, what are we going to do? I'm not going to raise my hand. He goes, yeah, Rick, what is it? I go, Matthew, I'm having a level 2 reaction to what you're saying. We're not going to do that. I'm going to go, Matthew, could you go back to the last slide? I have a question about the timeline. I go, yeah, absolutely. So we have this conversation all at level 1, and I keep hoping that you'll read between the lines and pick up that I am scared out of my mind.
Yeah, I mean, Rick, I had this many years ago, running a workshop one night on change, believe it or not, in a factory. And there was a guy at the back of the room who must have been about 25, 30 years older than the rest of them. And he kept swearing under his breath and muttering every time. And in the end, I thought, well, if I react to this, he's going to get taken through measures by HR. And I spoke to the shop steward, the union rep at the time on the night shift. And I said, look, I'm having real trouble, Charlie, with this guy. Can you come in and have a word with him? And he said, who is he? So I mentioned his name. He said, well, Matthew, you need to know the guy's a year off retirement. His wife's just died of cancer. And you're standing there talking about the wonderful changes that are going to take place in the future. There's no wonder he's swearing under his breath.
Yeah.
And I completely misread it. I saw this guy as being someone who was really difficult and was causing a nuisance. But from his point of view, yeah.
Yeah. That's a great story, and a really sobering story too. Yeah. And it goes to the point of we resist for good reasons. Not that you like that or not, but that's what it is. So level 1 is I don't get it. Second 2 is the emotional, I don't like it. And level 3 is I don't like you. And what that really means is I don't have trust and confidence in you for this kind of project, this particular kind of change. And so the reason for that might be our history together. That I come back from a workshop, I've just read a new book, and I'm going to introduce something. And that 6 months from now, I'm going to move on to something else. or that I start something and then I don't have the discipline to stick with it, and I don't apply the resources, I don't do what it takes. So I've got a history of you saying to yourselves, uh-oh. Or it may have nothing to do with us individually and may have everything to do with who I represent. So I say this a lot when I'm working with clients, in the UK or on the continent. I'll go, when I get called in on a project, if my client says, oh yeah, and here's Rick Maurer, he's a consultant from the United States, I know people are not going, oh great, another consultant from the United States. Oh, they have all the answers. Not only that, he has a beard, so I bet he's smart, probably works at a university. Yeah, see, there you go. And, I know that's not what's going on. What's probably going on in those little thought bubbles is, oh, where did they dig this one up? Oh man, these consultants, they're arrogant. They have all the answers. He's going to show us some model right now and tell us why he knows more than we do. And people generally laugh, and so it's in my best interest to understand that's what's probably going on, when I go in. And if I go in and say, well, I've written books on change and I've come up with this model, I'm just dead in the water, and I think for new leaders, this is it's important for all of us, but for new leaders, you want to make your mark, you want to do good work, and it's really easy to come in and go, oh, I got a new way of doing things, and people are going, wait a minute, we've been doing this for 22 years. What's going on? And so it could be a great idea, but it's sometimes we forget that level 3 relationship, and it really is critical. So what you need on the positive side, real quick, is people need to get what you're talking about. They need to like it, which means lean in, be excited, being willing to take part, tell me more. And the third is they have sufficient trust and confidence in us that they're willing to at least listen to us. Doesn't mean they're a pushover, but they go, yeah, Ian's a good guy. I don't get what he's saying yet. I'm kind of scared, but I trust Ian. I'm going to keep listening. So that level 3 is just a critical one. That may have been a long-winded answer. I apologize.
Glad, Rick, you left that level 3 with me. That was nice. And so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
The thing that I love about people like yourself who codify, they give a language to these things, these 3 levels. We're now talking about resistance and support for changes, and we're trying to give people some helpful ways to at least express it without saying it's the only way of doing it. But of course, as we've discussed in the past, the minute you label things, you realize it's much more complex than that. And we've had a conversation before where you said, again, not regretting, but the minute you label it, you have to then mention the fact that, of course, it's not that simple because they interplay with each other, they're connected, they're dynamic as well. I just wonder, have there been any new insights that you've had, particularly during the pandemic times, that as a global world that we've experienced, because we're experiencing a lot of I don't get it, I don't like it, and I don't like the people doing this to us in terms of our governments and things. Right? Any insights that you have?
I don't. It's a great question, and I wish I had a great answer. I agree with you that all 3 of those levels are at play. And what I'm finding here in the States, like right now, as we're recording this, one of the political conventions is going on right now. And so there's a tendency to say, oh, it's that other side. And to be casting a lot of blame, to try to cast a lot of level 3, like, oh, you can't trust it because it's coming from that television network or that newspaper or that party. And so and because people are frightened by a lot of things in the States right now, not that there isn't fear around the world, but there's a lot of, some riots broke out in a small Wisconsin city just 2 nights ago. So there's a lot of fear there. And that fear, I think often, this does relate to what you're talking about, Ian, that fear often can drive us right down to that level 3. It's a level 2 thing, I'm afraid, but I'm afraid of them. They're the ones who are hurting me. And you find that in union management kind of things, kind of old line kind of things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that now, and it's amazing. It's hard to hear dialogue, people actually talking with each other and listening to each other and willing to be influenced. And
And then with Brit, with the work that we do, the minute you can recognize the language, you can maybe categorize it a little bit with the complexity, and then of course we can offer some other support. And at least with some young leaders who may not have had all that experience to recognize them as things, you have something then maybe you can work with. And it comes back down to energy then, doesn't it? Are they supporting you? Are they kind of neutral? Are they actively resisting you? And I know energy is a big thing, because if we can help people direct that and or go with it as well, rather than fight it. So you don't overcome the energy, you just redirect it in your leadership to maybe aim at the thing that we all need to focus on. But that's not easy, especially for young leaders.
No. And by the way, the thing that I remember our conversation about this, the thing that I really regretted was not identifying the 3 levels. Actually, that's helped, because I remember I had a client who was head of a plant. He was a chemical engineer. And he called me one day and said, Rick, I got a level 3 issue right now. Bam. And it was a thing of trust with the head of the union. And if we'd had to talk about trust and go at it like right from the beginning, we would have been dancing around it for a very long time. I mean, he's a chemical engineer. I'm not wild about going into highly emotional, volatile things, but here we had a framework and allowed us to have this really rich conversation. So I'm glad that I gave it names. I wish, though, I hadn't called them levels. I meant to imply that level 1 is the easiest one to work with, level 2 is harder, level 3 is the hardest. I still believe that. The problem is sometimes people look at levels and go, okay, all right, I had that meeting, level 1's okay, they understand it. Next meeting we'll go to level 2, and and that's not what happens. It's all 3 are alive all the time, working for you or against you. And that's where I wish I had been clearer. But so much is in print, not just by me, but other people now talking about the 3 levels, that I can't use another word to describe them. So I'm stuck with my own creation.
Legend. It's excellent. I bet you've also had some offers of a level 4 definition as well, haven't you, at times?
It's funny, when I was working on the book, there were my colleagues that had gone through the training with me in Gestalt, and I said, okay, so I want your feedback. And one of the guys was arguing that there was a level 4, and he was talking particularly about the Middle East, which then, 25 years ago, was in a lot of turmoil. There still is a lot of turmoil. And he was suggesting that maybe there are some situations that are never solvable. And that may be true, it may not be true. I just think my focus is just on organizations. So I'm not looking at the political landscape or any of that other stuff. And I think in organizations, I've seen changes happen, not easily necessarily, but happen. But once you start to get out on the world stage, I just don't know if my model, I think it can be helpful, but I never intended it to look at international relations and all of that kind of stuff. So
one of the things that you've mentioned a couple of times now, Rick, all of what we're talking about is this element, I may not like you, I may not understand it, I may not like it, but if I trust you as someone that is genuine and is doing something for what they believe are the right reason,
yes,
I'm more likely to be won over, or at least to go along with what you're suggesting, than if I don't trust you at all. If somewhere in the background, in the history, we've either had a personal relationship that's not been healthy, or I've heard things about you that suggest that you say one thing and do something else. Mm-hmm. So as a young leader, they've got everything against them. They haven't got the experience. They've probably got wiser minds in the room who are saying, as you just said, we've been doing this for 22 years. Why are we changing stuff? But they've been probably recruited into that role because they've got new ideas, because they're bright, and someone somewhere has said, come on, we need to give this person an opportunity. So what would your guidance be to that individual in terms of building the trust in the first place, to give them a bit of a chance that even if the 3rd level kicks in, they're still gonna get.
Yeah. Okay. Let me tell a story and see if that addresses it well. It's this guy named Brian McGraw told me the story, and he was a young officer in the United States Air Force, and his expertise was in quality improvement, and so he got signed to an Air Force base. And his job was to be in charge of the team that worked on quality initiatives. And this is back in time when there actually were kind of discrete quality initiatives, so it wasn't as blended in as I see more today. At any rate, his new team said, watch out for the chief master sergeant. That is the highest enlisted rank. So in military, you have enlisted, you have officers. The highest enlisted person is an E9, the highest enlisted rank, a chief master sergeant in the Air Force. And they said he hates this quality movement. They said drive around him, he's a pothole. And Brian thought, you know, I know the Air Force well enough to know that you do not drive around a chief master sergeant. They, whether people like them or not, they are the chief spokesperson for the enlisted people, you know, and you do not ignore them. You do not, you know, diss them. And so he got that. So one of the things he did is he went over and introduced himself. And the guy said, look, I really, you know, I'm glad you're here, but, you know, I really think this quality stuff is a waste of time. And I think he just asked him some questions about that, but he didn't try to sell him. This is what's key, because sometimes we're in a hurry to do the right thing. And they got talking, and he said, hey, if, you know, because you're critical of it, if ever I come up with some idea that might be kind of boneheaded, could I run it by you and get your criticism? He goes, yeah, I could do that. So they left it there. Turns out they both loved hockey. So it became very easy to say, did you see da-da-da last night? And so they were able to start to create this friendship. And he said after about 6 months, the chief master sergeant called him in and said, hey, there's a quality problem over in that unit, and I think they could really use your help. And so later in his career, Brian had gotten a couple of promotions, and he was invited back for the retirement ceremony for this chief master sergeant. And it's really funny. I really get emotional about this story. He said, so he was there, and the chief master sergeant was, you know, getting, you know, whatever he got when you retire, and had a chance to say a few words. And he said, by the way, I want to point out Major McGraw. He is the only officer who ever listened to me. And it just really strikes me. And so sometimes our own desire, like I got to make my mark, you know, so I can become a first lieutenant and then a captain, and, you know, is we miss the human component, and we miss treating other human beings like we'd like to be treated. And I think for new leaders, that can be a temptation. And so one of the things just to watch for new leaders is, so when you get an idea in your head, or somebody says, hey, here's an idea that you need to take on, do you go into sales mode right away? Do you try to convince people that they're wrong? Do you try to say, no, I'm right, we're going to do this, and push ahead? And sometimes you may need to do that. Or is that your default position? Is that what we normally do? Or are you far more likely to do something more like Brian McGraw would have done? And I think that can be extremely helpful. I mean, humility, it doesn't mean throwing your intelligence away or your knowledge away, but just asking and say, so Brit, what do you think of all that stuff? You know, that kind of thing can, if we're actually willing to listen, and she goes, God, he's really interested in what I'm saying, can go, I mean, it seems so obvious, doesn't it? But it's not obvious. I mean, you just don't see. The reason I still have a job is because, you know, people aren't doing that stuff. So fortunately, nobody listens to me, so they keep hiring me back. It's very nice. So I'm being facetious. So.
It's really interesting that you bring this up as well. We've had a couple of conversations around compassionate leadership. Huh. And the elements of compassionate leadership is definitely be totally present and totally listening to someone. And also the aspect of humility comes into that. So I find it fascinating that you bring it up in terms of these levels of resistance as well, the human component.
It's huge. And that's where the resistance between you and me is a human component.
Yeah.
It's not just some logical little problem on a chalkboard somewhere, but it's, you know, in some ways you're resisting me as well as my ideas and all. And so it all gets mixed up, and then it becomes more emotional for me, and it's blah, 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 all that stuff.
So Rick, is there any, you know, apart from what you've just said, is there any other piece of advice that you would give? You know, you've walked into a room as Rick Maurer, you know, regardless of how you've been introduced or what you've said about yourself. And there's some young talent sitting in the room who are just in their first leadership roles. What other advice might you give them based on your experience and all the work?
Yeah. Since my whole thing is how do you build support? things. I mean, there's probably a lot of areas, like learning various kinds of software and blah, 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 blah. But in terms of support, that is working with other people so that you can influence and be influenced, is the first thing I would suggest they do is find out I call it what's on the list right now. So you just walked in, or maybe you've been there a month or 2 months. What are other people thinking, feeling, and saying to themselves about it? And that then starts to tell you what the lay of the land is. And if you like, I can give you an example that's not just for the new leaders, but I think it fits here. Is that okay? All right. So this is actually the story I was thinking about this morning as I'm working on this ebook. When I first had written my book, mid-90s, one of the big consulting firms would, as I said, they would parachute me in to teach my stuff. So they'd be working on a project with a client. I'd come in, I'd teach for half a day or a day, and I'd leave. But now everybody'd have the language of my stuff. So they were working with a client, an old line organization, been around for a century, old brick buildings, lots of layers, a lot of hierarchy, a lot of dyed-in-the-wool kind of stuff. And they were working with the planning team, and it was maybe 15, 20 men and women. And so I'm teaching my stuff, and this one guy says, Rick, next week the bomb is going to drop. And other people said, oh, it's going to be awful. Yeah. I mean, it was just amazing. And I said, what's going on next week? And they said, we're holding a meeting. And I go, yeah, it's an all-day meeting. And I'm going, yeah. And they said, oh, it's the first time we're doing business process reengineering, which at the time was hugely controversial. Some people refer to it as scorched earth policy on chain. I mean, it was just, people were scared. And they said, oh, people are going to hate it, and they're going to da-da-da. There's going to be blood everywhere. I mean, people are just really horrid images. And then they would say, what should we do? And, I mean, I knew as much about their situation as you do, or the people watching this video did. And for me to give advice at that point would be irresponsible. As much as I would have liked to have said, well, turn to page 42 in my book, and there's, it's not there. And so I wanted to be helpful, but I didn't know what to do. And I said, look, by the way, this mug that I have is from Loose Moose Theater Company. It's where I studied theater improvisation, which I use in my work. And this is like I had to improvise. Like, what am I going to do? So I wasn't doing, okay, now I'm going to mime a wall. I wasn't that. But I said, hey, everybody here knows somebody coming to that meeting, right? And they said, oh, yeah. And I said, what's going to be on their minds? And people started giving me stuff like this incredibly rapid pace. And I'm writing it down. And as I'm about halfway through this sheet of paper, I mean, I'm getting all this stuff, I knew what to do with it. So I get done, and I said, well, what do you make of that list? Oh, man, it's awful. That's why the bomb is going to drop, blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay, let's take level 1. Let me use a green marker. Which of these are, by the way, everything on the list was negative, so there were no positives. That's pretty unusual. Usually I find a blend of things. But this case, everything was. I said, okay, let me use a green marker. Which of these have to do with information? And I underlined those. And which of these have to do with feelings, level 2, fear in that. And level 3, which have to do with mistrust or lack of confidence. And I underlined those. And there's some were duplicate, they hit all 3 in that. And the guy who had asked me, said the bomb was going to drop, said, oh, that's why the bomb is going to drop. And people look at him, what are you talking about? He said, look at that. That whole list is color-coded. And level 1 is in green. Hardly anything on that list of their fears is level 1. Has to do with information and timelines and all of that. What's on the list is their fear and their lack of trust in us. And we've designed an entire meeting to deal with timelines, deliverables, details for this and this and this. And here is what they did brilliantly. And here's what I think anybody could do. They said to the consultant from the big firm and me, and said, look, guys, could we take the next hour and redesign that meeting? And we said, sure. They did not call on either of us for the next hour. So they could have said to him, because he worked for a big firm, well, what's a great idea you guys have? Or Rick, you've been around, what could you do? And we could have thrown something in. They didn't need it. That's what really excited me, is they had this information and they said, how are we going to do the same meeting, the same people coming, the same coffee, everything's the same. How do we do it in a way that might reduce some fears and might start to build their trust in us while covering all the information? And that just had a profound effect on virtually everything I do. And now I refer to the list. And when I work with a client, I want to know what's on the list. Because in one case, it was all positive. We trust the leaders. The timing is right. I'm glad we're getting together for it. And in that case, I was able to say, that planning meeting you got, you can cut out all that preliminary stuff of having people from corporate come in and do their slideshows. These people want to roll up their sleeves and get to work. So it was just, all we got to do is, control the energy that's there. So I would say to new leaders, you've got to know what's on the list. And I have a free ebook called The Magic List, and it's on my website, and it's no salesperson will call, none of that kind of stuff. But it basically says, okay, so how do you find out what's on the list? And one way is what these people did. They just imagined they were those other people, and they were able to come up with stuff. That's an amazingly simple and effective one. But there are other ways to do it too. But you gotta, if you're a new leader, you gotta know what's on the list. Like, I need to know the people who came before me. Were people like, boy, they were glad they were here. It was great to have new blood. Or it's like, oh God, here come these arrogant people just out of business school and blah, 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 blah. And all of that's going to be helpful as you start to create your own strategies.
Rick, sadly, we've run out of time. As always, these things, we get into these conversations and they flow and they flow and they flow. So it's been wonderful having you join us, and thank you for all your insights. Hopefully you'll be happy to join us again in the near future when we can
I would love to.
These topics a bit further. But great, thank you so much. And we can let you get back to your trombone playing.
Good. I appreciate that.